this lecture, we're going to finally turn to the study of clinical psychology, which is the study of mental illnesses and how to treat them, often known as psychopathology. For many of you, this is what psychology is all about. When I meet a stranger on a plane, for instance, and they ask me what I do, and I say I'm a psychologist, they might think of me as somebody who treats people. I might ask, what sort of problems do you deal with? And while we now know there's so much more to psychology than this, it's certainly true that clinical psychology is a central aspect of our field. And it's central for obvious reasons, because the mental illnesses are extremely important and extremely relevant, both from a theoretical perspective, if you're interested in how the mind works, but of course from a practical perspective, because of the seriousness of these problems. Some very large proportion of people, by some estimates about a half, will have some sort of mental problem throughout your development. And if you're not directly affected by mental illness, there's people you love who have. So to set the stage, let's think about what we're talking about when we're talking about mental disorders, because we could be talking about a lot of things. So right now, psychologists use the Diagnostic and Standard Manual 5. This is the most recent. It might be, if some time has gone by since I did this lecture, they might have something more advanced. And what you find in these pages is a lot of things. This includes crazy people muttering on the streets, as in schizophrenia. It might include a person with Down syndrome or autism, an elderly person with dementia, somebody with a depression so bad that they can't get out of bed, somebody with a social phobia who's profoundly awkward around people, someone who's a paranoid schizophrenic, maybe who meets the sort of ultimate stereotype of the mentally ill, who might believe that his or her thoughts are being monitored by the CIA, all sorts of things. You know what you're dealing with here. There are reasonably clear cases of what it's like to have a mental illness. But there are also difficult cases. So, for instance, what do you deal with a successful criminal, like Bernie Madoff, for instance, who swindled people out of their life savings? Is evil, where does evil end and mental illness begins? To take a fictional case, which often interests psychologists, is Batman mentally ill? He devotes his life to helping others. He's a successful multimillionaire in Gotham City. But he gets around on 1 hour of sleep a night. He dresses like a bat, and he's fully knowledgeable that a lot of his behaviors are due to a post-traumatic stress disorder after witnessing the murder of his parents. Some of you are addicts. Is this a mental illness? The DSM categorizes it as such, but some of you might push back. What about sex addiction? What about being a workaholic? What about eating too much? Where does illness end and free will begin? And this isn't just a philosophical problem. It's an everyday problem. You know, insurance companies, for instance, pay for illnesses. They reimburse you for your treatment. And then so the question of what an illness is a matter of some social importance. And what an illness is, for instance, also affects whether the government, programs like Medicare and Medicaid, will pay for. And it affects everyday life too. Suppose I'm teaching a large class and a student says, I'm sorry about my getting in my paper late, but don't dock my grade. I had a panic attack, or I had a schizophrenic break. Well, I definitely say, I feel terrible for you. Don't worry about it. I hope you're getting good treatment. On the other hand, if my students said they didn't do the paper on time because they were out late searching for sexual partners because of their sex addiction, I would have kind of a different response. So how do we think about mental illness? Well, here are some possibilities. And, one ancient view was it's due to demonic possession, and that's not true. Particularly people talk about schizophrenia, being schizophrenics as being possessed by the devil. I don't need to explain to you, the data doesn't support that. Another view worth talking about is a sort of cynical view, which is that the labels of mental illness are what we do to people who deviate from us socially. And it's worth taking seriously because, for instance, in many countries, including what used to be the Soviet Union, dissidents, people who protested against the governments, were put in insane asylums. As an example that comes closer to home, people with certain sexual desires, including homosexuality, used to be counted as mentally ill by the psychological and psychiatric community. It was only in 1973, for instance, that being gay was no longer counted as a mental illness. And this supports people like the psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, who in his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, said, mental illness is a myth. We call people sick, mentally ill, if they deviate from society, and the label of mental illness deprives them of responsibility and dismisses them. And there's a recent debate, for instance, over neurodiversity, which takes a similar tact, which argues that different ways of being, for instance, being mildly autistic, isn't an illness in any interesting sense, but more just a diverse aspect, a different way of processing information and dealing with the world, one that deserves respect. On the other hand, it'll be pretty clear that these really are illnesses in a very real sense. They lead to a lack of functioning, clearly. They're often associated with brain damage or brain trauma or unusual neurochemistry. And maybe most important, with treatment, people become happier and more competent and better able to deal with the world. And so this supports what's called the medical model of mental illness, where you think in terms of symptoms and an underlying disorder, which is ultimately treated. And so I'm going to go through the major classes of mental illness, the major mental illnesses, and I'll just talk very briefly about each one, and then I'll move to the more optimistic question of treatment. How do we fix people with these disorders?